Alright, so welcome to lesson 6 of our beginning C programming course. And in this lesson we're going to talk a little bit about control flow and how to control what statements get executed inside your program. So thus far we've been just looking at programs where every statement we write gets executed. Every single line of code that we write gets run. But now we're going to look at how to write programs where we can execute different lines of code based on conditions, and how we can have our program behave differently based on things like user input or variables. So let's start again with the basic structure of a C program. So the most basic and fundamental way that we can control the flow of our particular program is we can use an if statement. And an if statement basically looks like this. So our if statement, we give it a particular condition to evaluate, and basically it has to be something that we can evaluate to either true or false. The most simple of which we'll look at in a second is making sure a variable is equivalent to a particular value, and then if that condition is true, we run the code within the if block. Otherwise we don't do anything. So let's write a really basic if condition. So for our Boolean condition here, we're going to use two equal signs because this signifies equivalence rather than assignment. So as you can see, when we create our variable and assign it to a value, like x equals 10, we use a single equal sign because we're assigning x a value. But when we want a Boolean condition, we use the double equal sign to signify that we want a true or false value that is basically whether x is equal to the value that we say that we're specifying here. We're testing equivalence rather than assigning x a value. So that's why we use that double equal sign. And then from there, let's write some code based on this particular condition. Let's just have it print out some text. And then we can save and run this program and make sure it works properly. Let's add a new line. So now we can use make and compile and run our program. And it prints out that x is equivalent to 10, like we specified within our if condition. But now let's go and change the value of x. Here we set x to 20, but our condition is still checking for x to be equivalent to 10. So now our print statement won't get run when we make and execute this code. And as you can see, nothing was printed out when we ran our program because the value of x has been changed and our if condition has not executed the code within the if block. So in addition to having if blocks in your conditional statements for control flow, you can also add an additional block to your control flow statement here. You can add an else block, which basically gets executed in the case that your if condition doesn't get met. So basically, you have an if condition that specifies something, If that condition isn't met, then the code in your else condition will automatically be executed. And let's write an example and take a look at it. So right here after the if, I'm going to add an else. So basically, this means that one of these two conditions will always get executed. If x is 10, it'll execute the first if block, but if x is anything else, the second if block, or the else block, will be executed. And now let's make and run our code and see how that works. So the second block of text was printed out, that x is some other value besides for 10. So basically any code that you put in your else block will be run if your if condition isn't met. So in addition to having else, we can also chain multiple conditionals with else if. So basically an else if just works as another step in the middle that will be executed if the first condition isn't met. We evaluate a second condition. And if the second condition isn't met, then we finally have our else clause again, which will actually be executed. So let's write an else if clause to see how that works. So basically, if our first if condition isn't met, we evaluate a second if condition. And if neither of those are met, we finally go to our else clause. So we can make and run this as well. So our second if condition was met. The else if basically is the second check in our control flow. So if you want to check another condition, you can add an else if. In between an if and else, you can have as many else ifs as you want to check as many secondary conditions as you want to your primary if. The way that the flow works is if any of the else ifs are evaluated to be true, if the condition is met, then that code will be executed and none of the other else ifs will be executed. So only one path will be taken. Either your primary if, one of your else ifs, or your final else condition. So in addition to using if statements, we have one other tool in C that we can use to sort of manipulate the control flow of our program, and that's switch and case statements. And we can actually implement this same program that we wrote with if and if else statements exactly, and have it do the exact same thing with switch and case statements. And let's take a look at doing that. So basically, we have a switch on our particular variable, and then within that switch we'll add individual cases, which will basically be sort of like the conditions in our if statement. We can specify what value we want x to be and what we want to do for an individual case. So for instance, to implement our x equals 10 case, for our if condition, we'll write it like this in the switch statement. So that's basically all we have to do in order to implement our if condition for 10. And we can do the same thing for 20. And now we can make and run this program and basically get similar results to our last program. So as you can see, since x is equal to 20, our switch statement executed the 20 case within the switch. It basically works really similar to the if-else statements, except we have direct control over setting. We have a bunch of cases that we can set for whatever value our variable is, instead of having to write individual conditions for x equals to whatever value. So we also can actually implement the else case, like we had. So if none of our conditions get met, we can implement a case that gets run anyway, if none of the conditions are met. We can do that with a default case on our switch statement. So now, much like the else condition that we had, when none of the conditions are met, our switch statement will run a default case. So that's basically what will get executed if nothing is met, similar to our else after all of our else if statements or if statement. Now let's make and run that. So as you can see here, our default case got executed because none of the other cases within our switch statement have been run. So you can basically use switch and case statements the same way as you can use else and if statements. But one of the big differences is that the else-if cases in your if blocks are exclusive. So you'll only, unless you have a bunch of just if statements, you'll only ever run one case within the else-if case. Whereas in your switch and case statements, you can have multiple cases run. If you have one case, two cases that are not mutually exclusive, they both can be run, unless you use a break statement, which we'll get into looking at later. Alright, so that wraps up the basics of control flow in C. And in the next lesson, and a little bit soon, we're going to look at using control flow and applying it to user input. So how to get input from the user and change the behavior of your program accordingly. Alright, that's it.